No! So what you just watched was me dying in the final frame of the current hardest clear screen in all of Celeste. But what makes it so hard? It doesn't look that bad, right? It's how harder than rooms like this. And this. Or this. Well, it isn't even close, so sit down, grab some popcorn or something, and let me explain. So first off, let me explain where this room is even from and why it is like it is. This room is from the infamous map known as D1D7. This map made by the math guy is a backwards, or also known as an Edge-like map, where the creator took another map and basically put it in reverse, where you now go from the end of the map to the start instead of the other way around. In this case, it's a reverse version of 71D, another really hard map that is a 1-dash and super buff version of 7D by Monica. But what made this map special from other Edge-like maps though, is that this, besides already being a reverse version of a really hard map, also only made the absolute minimum amount of changes to still keep it possible. So basically only the smallest necessary changes, if even any, were made to the map to have it be possible in reverse, no matter how hard and precise this would make it. This led to some screens becoming a complete joke, with others not so much. This map was obviously made more as an experiment than something humans were supposed to play, and I can go into the complete history of it, but that might be better reserved for a future video. So let's just stick with the specific screen I'll be talking about today. This screen is known as 2k-3. It's the third screen in the 2000 meter checkpoint, hence why it's named that. This screen is by far the biggest difficulty spike in the map. But why, you may ask? Just looking at it, it might seem very straightforward, but let me tell you, it really isn't. Alright, so let's get into the details of the actual screen and start explaining. Normally when you play the screen forwards, you use these move blocks to line yourself up with these spinner gaps, which are pixel perfect. Fortunately though, you're able to use these blocks to line you up with the exact pixel you need. The issue though, when you have to beat it backwards, is that we don't have these blocks. The screen contains 7 of these pixel precise gaps, the first one being here at the very start. Thankfully for this one though, you can do a setup to have it always line up and performed correctly. For this setup, you walk up to the block, activate it, do an upright dash, from there you do a full jump and buffer a wave dash to the left. If you don't know what a buffer is, a buffer basically means doing an action right before it actually happens, so that it starts in the first possible frame. In Celeste is a 4-frame buffer window where you can do an input. For example, for a jump off the floor, you can press jump in the 4 frames right before you land and have Malin jump on the first frame when you do actually hit the floor. Alright, now after this buffered wave dash, you do an up left, which positions you perfectly over this corner, where you can barely jump off and make it through the gap. Now when we get to the next spot, we perform a slow fall to fall through this gap here. We do this by keep holding down the jump button so that Malin's gravity gets halved at around the peak of her fall. Now we approach the first really hard part of the screen. This next part is known as Subpixel V1 and is the first major roadblock of the screen. But to continue explaining, I will first have to explain what subpixels are. We use the word subpixels to refer to Malin's exact positioning within a pixel. The game tracks Malin's position as a float value, so this means you can be in different positions while still visually on the same pixel. Though it is impossible to know your exact subpixel values without the help of external tools like Celeste tasks, which I use to showcase it here. So why does this matter here now? Well, these two gaps are 8 pixels apart, meaning you will have to move through exactly 8 pixels to the right within this vertical space to make it true. Now let's assume you're in the middle of the pixel here at 0.5. If you hold right here for exactly 7 frames, you move 8.85 pixels, which will move you 9 pixels to the right and you will barely overshoot the gap. So that won't work. But what if you try to move right for 6 frames instead? Moving right for 6 frames will move you exactly 6.5 pixels, which will move you 7 pixels, and so we will end up 1 pixel short of making it into this gap. So 6 frames moves you too little, and 7 frames moves you too far. So how is this possible? Well, there's 2 options. The first is being far enough left in the pixel so that when you move right for 7 frames, you do not overshoot the gap. Since you move 8.85 pixels with a 7 frame right tap, you can make it true if you're positioned between 0.00 and 0.15 in the first gap. Now the issue with this is that we can't reliably position ourselves to be in the leftmost 0.15 every time, since this requires basically task level precision. And on top of that, we don't even know our exact subpixel position when playing normally. So that makes this option kind of out of the question. So how else can you do this? Well, another way you can do this is by doing 2 separate taps. Because of how acceleration works, if you move 2 separate times and slow down in between, you won't move the exact same distance you will if you do the same thing in one big tap. I'll give some examples. There's 3 tap patterns here that I am aware of working, though there are likely more. One of them is a 3 frame right, 2 frame release, 5 frame right again. There's also a 6 frame right, 5 frame release, and then 2 frame right again. Both these patterns move you 8.06 pixels, meaning there's only a 0.06 pixel window where it's impossible to make it over to the next gap, which is a lot more reliable than the 7 frame right hold, which had a massive 0.85 pixel window where it would be impossible. The issue with these though is that they require 3 frame perfect inputs to work, so the most common pattern is the last one I know of, which is 3 frame right, then somewhere between 3 to 8 frames of release, and then 6 frames right again. This pattern requires you to drop your speed back to 0 again, which takes a minimum of 3 frames, but you can't wait more than 8 since there isn't enough time to wait any longer than that. This also makes an 8 frame release pretty rare since that would require you to start holding right in the first possible frame. This pattern of taps will move you 8.13 pixels, meaning there's only a small 0.13 window where it's impossible to make it over to the gap, which is still really good and a lot more reliable than the 0.85 window from before. Alright, so let's move on to the next part. Next up is, surprise surprise, another pixel perfect gap. This gap is known as Mindblock V2. This is because you end up randomly mind blocking it a lot. Now for this gap, if you end up in the left half of the pixel in the previous gap, you can do a 21 frame press to the left to make it into the gap. But if you're in the right half of the pixel, this won't reach far enough, and trying to hold for 1 frame longer will make you overshoot it. So the most reliable method to go for, since it's impossible to know whether you're in the left or right half of the pixel, is to intentionally overshoot the gap and correct yourself back in with a small right tap. Optimally, this will be done by holding 22 frames to the left, then holding nothing for at least 9 frames so your speed drops back to 0, and then holding 2 frames to the right in time to make it into the gap. But of course, just as for the last gap, there's multiple variations of taps that work for this as well. Now in the next section, the screen actually calms down for a bit and we get to the easiest part. The only real significant thing I have to explain is the reframe jump. Basically, we need a way to get our dash back. So what we do is we take this move block up to grab the small ledge here, then wait until the block is about to respawn and fall back down to jump off the block as it's responding, so we can get our dash back without dying to the spikes on the top of the block. After this, we have this next spinner gap, which is actually not pixel perfect for once. You have 2 extra pixels of lenience here, and you can kinda use the wall in the background as a rough lineup for a drop. For the dash, after we move a bit to the left first to make the frame window for the dash bigger. Without moving to the left, this would otherwise be a 1 frame timing, but depending how far left you move, this can now become a 2 or 3 frame timing instead, making it much easier. Now after this short dashing part, we get to the final section, which is also easily the hardest and most precise section. Yet there's another set of 3 pixel perfect gaps, very similar to the ones before. For this first one, we do a corner jump on a small ledge here to make lining up this gap a bit easier. It is possible to get 0 frame in this corner jump though, which means that sometimes because of your vertical pixel position, it can become impossible to jump off the corner since you skip the frame where you're actually able to jump from the corner. This is just unlucky if this happens and you sadly can't really do anything about it. Now since the corner jump gives you 3 horizontal pixels to jump from, you won't always end up in the same position after the jump. Depending what pixel you jump from and what your exact subpixel positioning is, you can either land 1 or 2 pixels to the left of the gap, exactly line up with the gap, or even barely 1 pixel to the right of the gap. Optimally, what we want is to land 1 pixel left of the gap and use a small tap to move into the right pixel. You may be thinking why this is better than just landing on the correct pixel immediately, but I will get to that in a bit. So this next gap is the single thing that makes this screen so difficult to complete. Everything so far is hard to do, but the screen wouldn't nearly have the reputation it has without it. This gap is known as Subpixel V2. So what makes this gap so much harder than any of the other ones so far? Well, this section is basically a copy of the section at the start of the screen, hence why this one's named Subpixel V2. For this previous section though, we use 2 separate tabs to bypass having to rely on subpixels too much. But the difference here, if you haven't noticed yet, is that you have a lot less vertical space, which basically makes the 2-tab method no longer humanly viable since there's way too little time to consistently be able to fit 2 tabs here and make it to the next gap in time. So your best option here is to go back to the first method I mentioned previously and position yourselves within the 0.15 pixel window so you can make it in a single 7 frame tap. The unfortunate thing about that is, like I previously mentioned, is that it's way too precise to reliably do for a human since there's no way to know your subpixel positioning. And the precision required to control them that precise is pretty much task only. There's also no way to reset your subpixels or use a setup to make it consistent, you just kinda gotta pray for the subpixel lottery. Your best option is to try to move into the previous gap with a 1 frame right tap from the previous pixel. So 1 frame tap moves you 0.18 pixels, and if that ends up getting you into the right pixel, you have a pretty big chance to be far enough left, since there's only a 0.03 window left for it to not work. This still barely helps though, since you would still actually have to be on that left pixel with far enough right subpixel positioning that the 0.18 actually moves you to the next pixel, so it's still basically completely luck based. But let's assume you get there with the correct subpixels, you then still gotta hit the frame perfect 7 frame right tap, and when you get out there's still 1 final pixel perfect gap before the end of the screen, where you can do a frame perfect 11 tap to the left to make it through and win. So let's sum that up real quick. You gotta get all the way through the previous mentioned parts of the screen just to have a small chance at getting lucky and having good subpixels, which you won't even know if you have them or not. Then hit the exact 7 frame right tap and be prepared to quickly react and do the 11 frame left tap after that as well. This is ridiculous to say the least. I myself got to Subpixel V2 the first time after only about 3 hours of playing the screen. I passed it the first time at 23 hours, and then 2 more times at 29 and 27. But I only ended up playing the screen at nearly 70 hours of playing it. When playing this screen, there's no saying how long it would take. It can take well over 100 hours if the screen feels like it. 2k-3 shows no mercy. You just kinda gotta keep throwing yourself at it until eventually, at some point, you suddenly... Yes! 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 Wait, did it?